afternoon sun cast long, gentle shadows across the immaculate lawns of Thornfield Manor, where Mrs. Venetia Ashworth had orchestrated what she confidently declared would be the finest garden party Little Wickham has seen in a generation. The annual event in aid of the Church Restoration Fund had drawn nearly every soul from the village, their voices creating a pleasant symphony that mingled with the drowsy hum of bees among the herbaceous borders and the distant tinkling of teaspoons against fine bone china. Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably beneath the spreading canopy of an ancient copper beech, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of a metronome as she worked on what appeared to be an intricate Fair Isle pattern. To the casual observer, she seemed entirely absorbed in counting stitches and managing the complex interplay of colored yarns. Yet behind her mild blue eyes, she was conducting a far more sophisticated inventory, cataloging the subtle tensions, the careful avoidances, and the small social dramas that played out across the manicured stage of Mrs. Ashworth's garden with all the precision of a choreographed ballet. Mrs. Ashworth herself moved through her guests with the practiced grace of a seasoned hostess, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the warm afternoon, her lavender silk dress rustling softly as she paused to exchange pleasantries and ensure that teacups remained filled. At 68, she retained the commanding presence that had made her the undisputed arbiter of village society since her late husband's elevation to the bench some 30 years prior. Her smile was warm and genuine, yet Miss Marple noticed how it never quite reached her eyes when they fell upon certain guests, particularly Mr. James Thornbury, her late husband's nephew, who stood near the rose arbor with an expression of studied casualness that suggested anything but comfort. The refreshment tent, festooned with bunting in cheerful shades of pink and cream, buzzed with activity under the capable supervision of Mrs. Dorothy Bellwether, the vicar's wife. A practical woman with graying hair and hands that spoke of years spent arranging flowers and organizing charity drives, she moved efficiently between the long tables laden with cucumber sandwiches, seed cake, and an impressive array of jam tarts that would have done credit to a professional bakery. Assisting her with evident nervousness was young Polly Meadows, barely 19 and still possessed of that eager-to-please quality that often accompanies those new to village life. Miss Marple's attention drifted to the small cluster of guests gathered around the prize-winning roses, where Dr. Geoffrey Pemberton was engaged in animated discussion with Miss Sarah Caldwell about the merits of hybrid tea varieties versus the old garden roses. The young doctor, recently arrived from London to take over old Dr. Hartwell's practice, cut a handsome figure in his summer whites, though Miss Marple observed how his gaze kept straying toward the tea tent, or rather toward Polly Meadows, whose blushes had become increasingly frequent whenever the doctor was in proximity. Near the croquet lawn, Colonel Bantry held court with his usual collection of military anecdotes, his audience consisting primarily of Mr. Oliver Trent, the village banker, whose patient nods suggested either genuine interest or well-practiced diplomacy. The Colonel's wife, Dolly, had positioned herself strategically by the cake stall, where she could maintain a running commentary on the afternoon's proceedings while sampling what she declared to be research for next year's competition. "Such a lovely turnout," remarked Mrs. Price Ridley, settling her considerable frame into the wicker chair beside Miss Marple with a satisfied sigh. The village's self-appointed social chronicler had adorned herself in an unfortunate shade of magenta that competed vigorously with her florid complexion. "Though I must say, I do hope dear Venetia hasn't overextended herself with all these elaborate arrangements. The expense must be considerable." Miss Marple smiled gently, her fingers never pausing in their intricate dance. "I'm sure Mrs. Ashworth has everything well in hand. She's always been so very thorough in her planning." "Thorough, yes," Mrs. Price Ridley agreed, though something in her tone suggested alternative adjectives might have been more accurate. "Still, one does wonder. All those hired chairs, the professional catering equipment, the judge's pension, generous though it may have been, surely couldn't stretch to such extravagance year after year. Before Miss Marple could respond to this rather pointed observation, a subtle shift in the garden's atmosphere drew her attention. The pleasant murmur of conversation had developed an undercurrent of tension, like the barely perceptible change in air pressure that precedes a summer storm. Mrs. Ashworth's voice, though still maintaining its cultivated modulation, had acquired a steely edge as she spoke with Mr. Thornbury near the sundial. "I'm afraid that's quite impossible, James," she was saying, her words carrying clearly in the still air. "The matter was settled years ago, and I see no reason to revisit old decisions now." Mr. Thornbury, a man in his 40s with the soft appearance of someone accustomed to indoor pursuits, shifted uncomfortably. "But Aunt Venetia, surely you must see that circumstances have changed. The property values alone—" "Have changed nothing that concerns you," Mrs. Ashworth interrupted with quiet finality. "I suggest we discuss this at a more appropriate time, if at all." The exchange concluded with Mrs. Ashworth turning away with a sort of decisive movement that brooks no argument, leaving her nephew standing alone by the sundial with an expression that mingled frustration with something that might have been desperation. The incident rippled through the gathering like a stone dropped in, still water, creating circles of whispered speculation that spread from group to group. Miss Marple observed how quickly the news traveled, how it was embellished and interpreted according to each listener's particular perspective and prejudices. By the time the story reached the croquet lawn, it had evolved into something involving disputed inheritances and mysterious codicils. As the afternoon progressed, the shadows grew longer, and the golden light took on that particular quality that speaks of summer's gentle decline toward evening. The prize-giving ceremony for the rose competition had concluded, Dr. Pemberton's hybrid teas taking first place to general approval, and guests were beginning to drift toward the tea tent for final refreshments before departing. It was during this pleasant lull that Polly Meadows began the task of collecting used crockery from the various tables scattered across the lawn. Her movements had the careful precision of someone acutely aware of handling valuable china, each cup and saucer lifted with reverent attention. When she reached the small table where Mrs. Ashworth had been entertaining the Reverend Mr. Clement and his wife, she paused, her brow furrowing slightly. "Miss Marple," she called softly, approaching the copper beech with a delicate spode teacup balanced in her hands. "I wonder if you might—that is, there seems to be something rather odd." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with the mild interest of someone always ready to be helpful. "Yes, my dear." Polly extended the cup with trembling fingers. "There's something in the bottom, Miss Marple. A piece of paper, I think. It's wedged quite firmly beneath the tea leaves." Setting aside her knitting with careful deliberation, Miss Marple accepted the cup and examined its contents with the methodical attention she might have given to a particularly complex stitch pattern. Nestled against the fine porcelain, partially obscured by the dregs of Earl Grey, was indeed a small, tightly folded piece of paper. The edges showed signs of moisture, and the quality of the paper itself, cream-colored and heavy, suggested expensive stationery. "How very curious," Miss Marple murmured, carefully extracting the paper with the tip of her knitting needle. "One does wonder how such a thing might have found its way into a teacup." As she unfolded the damp paper with gentle precision, both women leaned closer to examine its contents. The message, written in a bold, masculine hand with what appeared to be a fountain pen, was brief but unmistakably menacing. "Your secrets have been patient long enough. The time for games is over. Meet me by the summer house at 4 o'clock, or tomorrow the whole village will know what you've done. This is your final warning." The cheerful sounds of the garden party continued around them, children's laughter, the gentle clink of china, the murmur of satisfied conversation. But Miss Marple felt that familiar stirring of interest that always accompanied the discovery of something not quite right, something that disrupted the careful patterns of ordinary life. "Polly, my dear," she said quietly, folding the letter with the same care she might have shown to a pressed flower. "I think perhaps we should mention this to Mrs. Ashworth. Though," she added, glancing toward the tea tent where their hostess was engaged in animated conversation with the colonel, "perhaps we might wait until the guests have departed. No need to spoil such a lovely afternoon with unpleasant mysteries." But even as she spoke, Miss Marple was already beginning to wonder whether this anonymous threat might not be the beginning of something far more serious than a simple case of village blackmail. In her considerable experience, letters such as these rarely remained merely letters for very long, and the person who had placed it so deliberately in that particular teacup had chosen both their method and their timing with considerable care. The garden party continued its gentle course toward evening, but the shadows seemed to have grown longer, and the cheerful chatter had acquired an edge that hadn't been there before. Miss Marple folded the threatening letter carefully into her handbag, her mind already beginning to sort through the afternoon's observations with the methodical precision of someone who understood that in villages like Little Wickham, every secret eventually found its way to the surface, though not always in ways that their keepers might have anticipated. As the garden party began to wind down, Miss Marple remained beneath the copper beech, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm while her mind worked through the implications of the threatening letter now secured in her handbag. The afternoon had taken on that peculiar quality she'd observed so many times before, where ordinary social interactions continued on the surface, while darker currents moved beneath, invisible to most but unmistakable to those who knew how to look. Polly Meadows moved about her duties with visible nervousness, her earlier discovery having clearly unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Each time she passed Miss Marple's position, her eyes would dart toward the handbag with a sort of furtive curiosity that suggested she was already beginning to regret her involvement in the matter. When Dr. Pemberton approached to compliment her on the efficiency of the tea service, the poor girl nearly dropped an entire tray of china. "Steady on," the doctor said with a gentle smile, his hands moving quickly to stabilize the wavering tray. "No harm done. These garden parties can be rather overwhelming, can't they?" "Oh, yes, sir," Polly managed, though her voice carried a tremor that had little to do with social obligations. "It's just that sometimes one sees things or finds things that perhaps—" "Polly, dear," Mrs. Bellwether appeared at her elbow with practiced efficiency. "If you could help me with the remaining sandwiches, we mustn't let them go to waste." The interruption was smoothly executed, but Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Bellwether's eyes lingered on Dr. Pemberton with something approaching wariness. The vicar's wife had been managing village social dynamics for nearly 2 decades, and she possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense when conversations were veering toward potentially troublesome territory. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Mrs. Ashworth, who was making her final rounds among the remaining guests. Her hostess duties were being performed with the same gracious efficiency that had characterized the entire afternoon. Yet there was something in her manner, a subtle tension around her eyes, a fractional hesitation before each smile, that suggested the earlier confrontation with her nephew had affected her more deeply than she cared to admit. The mellow chiming of St. Jude's church clock drifted across the lawns, marking the 4:45. Miss Marple's fingers paused momentarily in their knitting as she observed the subtle shifts in behavior that the approaching hour seemed to trigger among the guests. Mrs. Ashworth's movements had become more deliberate, though she maintained her composure with the skill of long practice. Near the rose arbor, James Thornberry stood with an expression of studied casualness that fooled no one who bothered to look closely. "Such a lovely afternoon," Mrs. Price Ridley remarked, settling her considerable frame more comfortably in the wicker chair beside Miss Marple. "Though I must say there does seem to be a certain tension in the air. Family disagreements can be so unpleasant, particularly when aired in public." Miss Marple made a non-committal sound of agreement while observing how Mrs. Ashworth had begun moving with apparent casualness toward the path that led to the summer house. Her step was unhurried, the angle of her chin composed, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that spoke of a woman steeling herself for an unpleasant encounter. "I believe Mrs. Ashworth mentioned needing her wrap," Miss Marple observed mildly. "The afternoon does seem to be growing cooler." But even as she spoke, Miss Marple was cataloguing the positions and movements of the other guests. Mr. Oliver Trent had positioned himself near the croquet lawn, where he could observe the garden's various paths without appearing to do so. Dr. Pemberton had been waylaid by Mrs. Bellwether with complaints of feeling faint in the heat, though the vicar's wife appeared remarkably robust for someone requiring medical attention. James Thornbury remained by the sundial, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose that might have suggested contemplation if not for the rigid tension in his frame. As 4 o'clock approached, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the nature of secrets and the peculiar power they wielded over human behavior. The threatening letter had spoken of games being over, of patience exhausted, of revelations that would shake the village's carefully maintained social order. In her considerable experience, such threats were rarely idle, and the person who had crafted that message possessed not only knowledge of Mrs. Ashworth's vulnerabilities, but also the cold calculation to use them effectively. The summer house stood at the far end of the garden, partially obscured by the ancient cedar walk that had been planted by some long-dead Ashworth ancestor. From her position beneath the copper beech, Miss Marple could just make out the white-painted structure through the trees, its Victorian Gothic windows catching the afternoon light like watchful eyes. St. Jude's clock began its measured chiming of the hour, each note carrying across the garden with crystalline clarity. As the 4th chime faded into silence, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Ashworth pause at the fork in the gravel path, her hand resting briefly on the stone pillar that marked the entrance to the cedar walk. For a moment she seemed to hesitate, and Miss Marple caught a glimpse of something that might have been fear flickering across her composed features. Then, with the decisive movement of someone who had made an irrevocable choice, Mrs. Ashworth turned down the path toward the summer house, her figure gradually disappearing into the dappled shadows of the cedar trees. Miss Marple continued her knitting, but her attention was now focused entirely on the various reactions to Mrs. Ashworth's departure. James Thornbury had begun moving in the same direction, his casual stroll fooling no one who bothered to observe the tension in his gait. Dr. Pemberton had managed to extricate himself from Mrs. Bellwether's attentions and was now standing near the herbaceous border, his medical bag conspicuously absent despite his earlier concerns about the heat affecting the guests. What fascinated Miss Marple most was not who was moving toward the summer house, but who was making very deliberate efforts to remain exactly where they were. Mr. Trent had engaged Colonel Bantry in what appeared to be an animated discussion about local banking matters, though his eyes kept straying toward the cedar walk. Mrs. Bellwether had suddenly discovered an urgent need to reorganize the remaining refreshments, her movements creating a sort of purposeful bustle that drew attention to her very presence in the tea tent. Even more interesting was Polly Meadows, who had positioned herself near the kitchen garden gate where she could observe the summer house path while appearing to be engaged in the entirely innocent task of collecting herbs for Mrs. Ashworth's cook. The girl's nervousness had transformed into something approaching watchfulness, and Miss Marple suspected that her discovery of the threatening letter had awakened an investigative curiosity that would not easily be satisfied. The afternoon had grown very still, as if the garden itself was holding its breath. Even the bees seemed to have suspended their drowsy humming among the herbaceous borders, and the usual cheerful chatter of the remaining guests had developed an underlying current of tension that spoke of secrets about to be revealed and carefully maintained facades about to crumble. Miss Marple folded her knitting with deliberate care and placed it in her bag beside the threatening letter. In her considerable experience, the moments immediately following such clandestine meetings were often the most revealing, when people's true natures emerged from behind their social masks and the careful choreography of village life gave way to something far more primitive and dangerous. The game, as the letter writer had so dramatically declared, was indeed over, But Miss Marple suspected that what was about to begin would prove far more complex and deadly than a simple case of blackmail or family disputes over inheritance. The afternoon sun continued to slant through the copper beech leaves, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the immaculate lawns. But beneath the surface tranquility of Little Wickham's most elegant garden party, something dark and patient was finally beginning to stir. The minutes that followed 4 o'clock stretched with the peculiar elasticity that accompanies moments of high tension, where each second seems to expand, while the participants remain frozen in attitudes of forced normalcy. Miss Marple continued her knitting with steady precision, but her attention was entirely focused on the subtle choreography unfolding across Mrs. Ashworth's carefully manicured stage. James Thornbury had indeed followed his aunt's path toward the cedar walk, though his approach lacked the decisive quality that might have suggested innocent family concern. Instead, he moved with the hesitant gait of someone torn between competing impulses, pausing frequently to examine hedgerows and garden ornaments that had apparently never commanded his attention before. When he finally disappeared into the dappled shadows of the cedar trees, Miss Marple noted that his shoulders carried the rigid tension of a man steeling himself for an unpleasant encounter. Dr. Pemberton had positioned himself near the kitchen garden with studied casualness, ostensibly admiring the late-season vegetables while maintaining a clear view of the summer-house path. His medical bag remained conspicuously absent, suggesting that whatever he anticipated finding would require professional attention of a different sort entirely. When Polly Meadows emerged from behind the herb beds, her basket clutched tightly against her chest, the young doctor's immediate movement toward her confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicion that the afternoon's revelations extended far beyond a single threatening letter. The transformation of Thornfield Manor from elegant social gathering to crime scene unfolded with the methodical precision that Inspector Craddock brought to all his investigations. The constables from Much had moved with quiet efficiency, their presence creating an invisible perimeter that separated the witnesses from the stark reality of what lay within the summer house's white-painted walls. The cheerful bunting that had decorated the refreshment tent now seemed grotesquely inappropriate, its pink and cream colors a jarring contrast to the gravity of murder. Miss Marple remained beneath the copper beech, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, while she observed the subtle choreography of official procedure. Inspector Craddock's approach impressed her with its thoroughness. He understood, as she did, that in village murders the truth often lay not in dramatic revelations, but in the careful accumulation of small inconsistencies and unguarded moments. When he glanced in her direction with that particular expression she had come to recognize, she knew he would welcome her unofficial assistance, though protocol demanded they maintain the fiction of her merely being another witness. The drawing-room at Thornfield Manor, with its Regency furniture and china shepherdesses, had been transformed into a temporary interview station. Inspector Craddock's questions carried the authority of long experience, though Miss Marple noted how he allowed each witness to construct their own narrative before probing for inconsistencies. James Thornbury entered first, his earlier pallor now replaced by a carefully controlled composure that spoke of considerable mental preparation. "I followed my aunt to the summer house because our earlier conversation had been unfinished," he explained, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I wanted to apologize for any distress I might have caused. When I reached the cedar walk, I hesitated. It seemed inappropriate to interrupt what might have been a private moment of reflection. I waited near the statue of Pan, thinking to speak with her on her return. Then Miss Meadows cried out." The account was perfectly reasonable, yet something in its very completeness suggested rehearsal rather than spontaneous recollection. Miss Marple observed how Thornbury's eyes avoided the window that gave view of the summer house, and how his right foot tapped against the carpet leg with nervous regularity, the sort of unconscious movement that betrayed anxiety despite outward calm. Dr. Pemberton's medical assessment proved more revealing than his earlier statements. "The injury appears consistent with a blow to the back of the head," he reported with professional precision. "The glass paperweight found nearby seems too light to have caused such damage, though there are scuff marks on the writing desk suggesting something was moved hastily. Most curious is the positioning. Mrs. Ashworth was found face down, yet the injury suggests she was struck from behind while facing the desk." When Polly Meadows was called to give her statement, her nervousness had transformed into something approaching watchfulness. Her account of finding the threatening letter remained consistent, but Miss Marple noted new details emerging under Inspector Craddock's gentle questioning. The teacup was Mrs. Ashworth's personal china, the spode with the cornflower border, Polly explained, her voice steadier now. "She always used the same one, and she never took sugar. That's why I noticed the grain scattered on the saucer when I collected it. Mrs. Ashworth was very particular about such things." Inspector Craddock's interest sharpened visibly. "Sugar grains? You're certain Mrs. Ashworth didn't take sugar?" "Oh, no, sir, never. She often mentioned how it was a young person's habit, and she prided herself on maintaining her figure." Polly's eyes darted toward Dr. Pemberton, who was waiting in the hall. "The doctor can confirm. He's mentioned how rare it is to find someone of her age so disciplined about such things." The sugar detail proved to be only the beginning of the physical evidence that would reshape their understanding of the crime. When Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple examined the summer house more thoroughly, they discovered additional inconsistencies that painted a far more complex picture than a simple confrontation gone wrong. The writing desk in the summer house told its own story to those who knew how to read it. The glass paperweight sat too precisely in its corner, positioned with the sort of deliberate care that suggested someone had moved it and then attempted to restore its original placement. The small ceramic vase containing sweet peas had been knocked over and hastily righted, leaving a faint watermark on the polished wood that spoke of nervous haste. Most intriguing was the blotting paper on the escritoire. The top sheet was pristine, but when Inspector Craddock lifted it with careful precision, the sheet beneath revealed mirror impressions in violet ink, evidence of correspondence that Mrs. Ashworth herself would never have written, given her preference for blue-black fountain pen ink. "Someone wrote a note here," Miss Marple observed, studying the faint impressions with the same attention she might give to a complex knitting pattern. "The violet ink suggests either a lady's correspondence or someone who wished to appear as such. The pressure marks indicate urgency. This was not a leisurely composition." The implications were troubling. The threatening letter in black ink had been designed to force a meeting, but the violet ink impressions suggested a second communication, one intended to soothe or explain rather than threaten. Miss Marple found herself considering the psychology of someone who could be both menacing and conciliatory, someone skilled enough to manipulate Mrs. Ashworth's responses with carefully crafted appeals to different aspects of her character. As the interviews continued, Miss Marple observed the subtle dynamics that emerged when people believed themselves unobserved. Mrs. Bellwether's efficiency in managing the crisis seemed almost too practiced, as though she had anticipated the need for crowd control and witness management. Mr. Trent's banker's composure remained intact, but his hands moved frequently to his jacket pocket, seeking reassurance from some familiar object, perhaps a fountain pen that wrote in violet ink. Most revealing were the unspoken communications between various witnesses. When Inspector Craddock mentioned examining all the refreshment arrangements, Miss Marple caught the brief exchange of glances between Dr. Pemberton and Mrs. Bellwether, a slight nod from him met by an almost imperceptible shake of her head. The interaction lasted barely a second, yet it spoke of shared knowledge and careful coordination. The village's response to the tragedy followed predictable patterns, with gossip spreading like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Mrs. Price Ridley had already begun constructing elaborate theories involving mysterious strangers and dark family secrets, while Colonel Bantry maintained his military bearing despite the obvious shock to his system. Yet beneath these familiar reactions, Miss Marple sensed something more troubling. The feeling that several people possessed knowledge they were not sharing, and that Mrs. Ashworth's death might have been as much about silencing inconvenient truths as settling old scores. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the formal statements concluded, Miss Marple found herself considering the curious timing of the entire affair. The threatening letter had been placed with deliberate precision, the confrontation timed to coincide with the garden party's natural conclusion, and the physical evidence arranged with considerable sophistication. Yet beneath these carefully orchestrated elements lay something more human and therefore more dangerous. The suggestion that multiple people had possessed knowledge of Mrs. Ashworth's vulnerabilities. The sugar grains on the teacup saucer, the violet ink impressions on the blotting paper, the careful repositioning of the glass paperweight, each detail pointed to someone who understood both Mrs. Ashworth's habits and the psychology of deception. This was not a crime of passion, but of calculation, executed by someone who could move between threat and reassurance with practiced ease. When Inspector Craddock announced that he would need to conduct more detailed interviews the following morning, Miss Marple observed the various reactions with her characteristic attention to human nature. Most of the witnesses accepted this development with resigned cooperation, but she noted that several seemed almost relieved by the postponement, as though they needed time to prepare for more intensive questioning. As the last of the garden party guests departed into the gathering dusk, Miss Marple carefully folded her knitting and prepared to assist Inspector Craddock with the delicate task of unraveling the web of secrets that had led to murder in Little Wickham. The threatening letter in her handbag seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, its crude ultimatum having set in motion a sequence of events that revealed far more about the village's hidden dynamics than anyone had anticipated. The game, as the letter writer had declared, was indeed over, but Miss Marple understood that what was beginning would prove far more complex and dangerous than anyone yet suspected. The peaceful afternoon shattered, not with drama, but with a sound that would haunt Little Wickham for years to come. Polly Meadows' sharp intake of breath, followed by a cry that seemed to tear itself from her throat against her will. The sound carried across the garden with terrible clarity, cutting through the drowsy hum of bees and the distant murmur of conversation like a blade through silk. The effect was immediate and devastating. Conversations ceased mid-sentence, teacups froze halfway to lips, and every head turned toward the cedar walk with the synchronized precision of a flock of birds responding to an unseen predator. Mrs. Price Ridley's elaborate critique of modern rose cultivation died on her lips, replaced by a sharp gasp that spoke of genuine shock rather than theatrical effect. Dr. Pemberton was already moving before Polly's cry had fully faded, his medical training overriding any considerations of social propriety. His long strides carried him swiftly toward the summer house, though Miss Marple observed that he moved with the purposeful efficiency of someone who suspected what he might find rather than the uncertain haste of genuine surprise. What followed unfolded with the inexorable quality of Greek tragedy, each moment building upon the last toward an inevitable conclusion that no one seemed quite prepared to face. James Thornbury emerged from the cedar walk with his face the color of old parchment, his careful composure utterly shattered. He moved with the unsteady gait of someone who had received a physical blow, his eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine horror. "There's been an accident," he managed, his voice barely carrying across the lawn. "Mrs. Ashworth, in the summer house. I think she's—" The sentence remained unfinished, but its implications hung in the afternoon air like smoke from a distant fire. Dr. Pemberton's voice, when it came, carried the controlled authority of professional training. "Everyone please remain where you are. Colonel Bantry, if you would be so kind as to telephone for the police immediately. No one else should approach the summer house until the authorities arrive." The word authorities seemed to crystallize the transformation that had overtaken the garden party, changing it from a genteel social gathering into something altogether more sinister. Mrs. Bellwether moved with her characteristic efficiency to comfort Polly, who had begun to tremble violently, while Colonel Bantry strode toward the house with military precision to make the necessary telephone call. Miss Marple remained seated beneath the Obup copper beech, though every instinct urged her to join the small crowd gathering at the entrance to the Cedar Walk. In her considerable experience, the moments immediately following such discoveries often revealed more about the true nature of circumstances than the events themselves. She observed how Mr. Trent had made no move to approach the scene, instead positioning himself near the croquet lawn where he could observe the various paths and exits from the garden. His banker's composure remained intact, but his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Equally telling was Mrs. Bellwether's response to the crisis. The vicar's wife had immediately taken charge of crowd control with the sort of practiced efficiency that spoke of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. Yet Miss Marple noted how her eyes kept returning to specific individuals among the guests, as though she was conducting her own careful inventory of who was present and who might have reasons for being elsewhere. When Dr. Pemberton finally emerged from the summer house, his face carried the grim certainty of professional diagnosis. "I'm afraid Mrs. Ashworth has suffered a fatal injury," he announced with careful precision. "The police will need to examine the scene before anyone else enters." As the initial shock began to settle into the more manageable rhythms of procedure and protocol, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the curious staging of the afternoon's events. The threatening letter had spoken of final warnings and exhausted patience, suggesting a confrontation that had been building for some time. Yet the actual discovery had come through Polly Meadows, whose nervous energy throughout the afternoon now seemed less like social anxiety than the behavior of someone carrying knowledge too heavy for her young shoulders. The summer house itself, visible through the cedar trees as a white-painted structure with Gothic windows, had been transformed from a charming garden ornament into something altogether more ominous. Miss Marple could just make out Dr. Pemberton moving carefully within, his medical training evident in the way he examined the scene without disturbing what might prove to be crucial evidence. When Inspector Craddock arrived from Much Haddam with the sort of quiet efficiency that spoke of considerable experience with village tragedies, Miss Marple felt a familiar stirring of interest. The inspector's tired eyes took in the scene with swift precision, cataloguing not just the physical evidence but the subtle tensions and careful avoidances that characterized the assembled guests. As statements were taken and the machinery of official investigation began its methodical work, Miss Marple found herself considering the curious pattern of behavior she had observed throughout the afternoon. The threatening letter had been placed with deliberate care in Mrs. Ashworth's teacup, suggesting intimate knowledge of her habits and movements. The confrontation in the summer house had been timed to coincide with the garden party's natural conclusion, when guests would be departing and attention would be focused elsewhere. Yet beneath these carefully orchestrated elements lay something more troubling. The suggestion that multiple people had possessed knowledge of Mrs. Ashworth's vulnerabilities and that the afternoon's tragedy might have been as much about silencing inconvenient truths as about settling old scores. The missing teacup that Dr. Pemberton had mentioned, the careful positioning of what appeared to be a glass paperweight, and the curious absence of any signs of struggle all pointed to a crime that had been planned with considerable sophistication. As the shadows lengthened across Mrs. Ashworth's immaculate lawns and the last of the garden party guests were interviewed and dismissed, Miss Marple carefully folded her knitting and prepared to assist Inspector Craddock with the delicate task of unraveling the web of secrets that had led to murder in Little Wickham. The threatening letter in her handbag seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, its crude ultimatum having set in motion a sequence of events that she suspected would reveal far more about the village's hidden dynamics than anyone had anticipated. The game, as the letter writer had so dramatically declared, was indeed over. But Miss Marple understood that what was about to begin would prove far more complex and dangerous than a simple case of blackmail or family disputes. It would be a careful excavation of the buried truths that lay beneath the surface of even the most respectable English village, where murder could bloom as easily as roses in the most carefully tended garden. The evening that settled over Little Wickham following Mrs. Ashworth's murder carried an unnatural stillness, as though the village itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple sat in her cottage parlour, the threatening letter spread carefully beside her knitting, while she considered the afternoon's troubling revelations. The crude ultimatum seemed almost theatrical in its melodrama, yet the careful placement in Mrs. Ashworth's personal teacup suggested someone with intimate knowledge of her daily routines. Inspector Craddock arrived at 8:30, his weathered features reflecting the weight of an investigation that had already proven more complex than anticipated. He accepted Miss Marple's offer of tea with the grateful efficiency of someone who understood that her unofficial assistance often proved more valuable than formal procedures. "I've been examining this more closely," Miss Marple said, lifting the threatening letter with careful precision. "The paper quality is quite distinctive. Expensive, with what appears to be a watermark." She held it toward the lamplight, where a faint impression became visible. "The Thornfield crest, I believe. Whoever wrote this had access to Mrs. Ashworth's personal stationery." Inspector Craddock leaned forward with renewed interest. So not a stranger, then. Someone who had been in the house, possibly recently. Indeed. And notice the handwriting, educated, controlled, yet deliberately crude in its language. I suspect our correspondent was playing a role rather than expressing genuine desperation. Miss Marple set down the letter thoughtfully. The masculine hand suggests we should look for a man, yet something about the theatrical nature troubles me. In my experience, people often reveal more about themselves when they're trying to appear as someone else. The inspector produced his notebook with methodical precision. Mrs. Ashworth's financial situation proves more interesting than her public persona suggested. According to Mr. Trent at the bank, she had been making increasingly large withdrawals over the past 6 months, amounts that far exceeded her normal household expenses. When pressed about her investment decisions, he claimed professional discretion prevented further elaboration. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with the particular interest she reserved for significant details. Large withdrawals suggest either financial difficulties or payments to someone who preferred cash transactions. Given the threatening letter's mention of games being over, I wonder if Mrs. Ashworth might have been the victim of blackmail rather than the keeper of dangerous secrets. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the cottage door. Polly Meadows stood on the threshold, her young face pale with exhaustion and something approaching fear. She clutched a small bundle wrapped in a tea towel, her hands trembling slightly as she extended it toward Miss Marple. "I'm sorry to disturb you so late," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I found something when I was helping Mrs. Bellwether with the washing up. I thought you should see it before anyone else." Miss Marple unwrapped the bundle with gentle care, revealing the cornflower-spode teacup that had been conspicuously absent from the evening's inventory. The delicate china had been cracked along its rim, though not severely enough to make it unusable. More significantly, a faint residue of sugar crystals clung to the bottom of the cup, despite Polly's earlier certainty that Mrs. Ashworth never took sugar in her tea. "Where did you find this, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, her tone carefully neutral. "In the scullery sink, wrapped in a dishcloth," Polly replied. "Mrs. Bellwether said it must have been damaged during the clearing up, but—" She hesitated, her eyes darting between Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock. The cloth had ink stains on it. Violet ink. And Mrs. Ashworth always wrote with blue-black fountain pen ink. Inspector Craddock examined the stained cloth with professional interest. The violet smears were faint but unmistakable, suggesting someone had used the fabric to clean a fountain pen, or perhaps to wipe away incriminating evidence. Combined with the violet ink impressions found on the summer-house blotting paper, the evidence pointed towards someone who had written at least 2 different communications related to Mrs. Ashworth's death. "The sugar troubles me most," Miss Marple observed, studying the crystalline residue with her magnifying glass. Someone wanted to create the impression that Mrs. Ashworth had been nervous or agitated enough to forget her usual habits. Yet the amount is too precisely scattered. It suggests deliberate placement rather than hurried consumption. As they discussed the implications, Miss Marple found herself considering the psychology of someone who could orchestrate such elaborate deception. The threatening letter had served to force a confrontation, while the violet ink communication had likely been designed to reassure or manipulate Mrs. Ashworth into compliance. This suggested someone who understood her character well enough to know which emotional buttons to press. The following morning brought the inevitable wave of village speculation, delivered primarily through Mrs. Price Ridley, who arrived with fresh scones and an even fresher supply of theories. "The general consensus," she announced with the authority of someone who considered herself the village's unofficial chronicler, "is that James Thornbury is behind it all. Such a public argument, and everyone knows he stood to inherit considerably." Miss Marple listened patiently to the familiar pattern of village logic that inevitably seized upon the most obvious suspect. Yet her instincts, refined by decades of observing human nature, suggested something far more sophisticated was at play. James Thornbury certainly possessed motive and opportunity, but the careful staging of evidence pointed towards someone with considerably more cunning than his transparent. When Inspector Craddock returned from his morning interviews, his expression carried the grim satisfaction of someone who had uncovered significant information. "Mr. Trent proved more forthcoming under official questioning," he reported. Mrs. Ashworth's withdrawals were indeed connected to what he termed irregular arrangements, monthly payments to someone he refused to identify, claiming client confidentiality. The financial trail painted a troubling picture of systematic exploitation. Mrs. Ashworth had been making regular cash payments of substantial amounts, always collected in person by someone who never provided identification. The timing coincided with her increasingly strained behavior at social gatherings and her growing reluctance to discuss future plans for the estate. Blackmail, then, Miss Marple concluded. But the question remains, was she paying to keep her own secrets hidden, or was someone using her to conceal their activities? The threatening letter's promise to reveal everything to the village suggests the former, yet the sophistication of the murder points toward the latter. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, a groundskeeper's boy arrived at the cottage with news that would reshape their understanding of the crime entirely. While clearing debris from the kitchen garden hedge, he had discovered something wrapped carefully in oiled cloth. Mrs. Ashworth's missing walking stick, its silver head stained with what appeared to be blood and hair. The weapon's discovery location suggested careful planning rather than panicked disposal. Someone had taken considerable time to clean and wrap the evidence, then placed it where routine maintenance would eventually bring it to light, but not immediately. This level of calculation pointed towards someone who understood both the mechanics of criminal investigation and the rhythms of estate management. Miss Marple examined the walking stick with the methodical attention she brought to complex knitting patterns. The silver head bore the Ashworth family crest, making it instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with the household. More significantly, the positioning of the bloodstains suggested the weapon had been wielded by someone of average height, ruling out several suspects while implicating others. As evening approached and the various pieces of evidence began to form a coherent picture, Miss Marple found herself considering the curious duality of their unknown murderer. Someone sophisticated enough to plan an elaborate deception, yet careless enough to leave a trail of physical evidence. Someone familiar enough with Mrs. Ashworth's habits to manipulate her effectively, yet distant enough to misunderstand the significance of details like her aversion to sugar. The threatening letter had been designed to create a particular impression about the killer's identity and motivations, while the actual murder had been executed with the cold efficiency of someone who understood that Mrs. Ashworth's death was necessary to protect far more dangerous secrets than village scandal. The game, as the letter writer had declared, was indeed over, but Miss Marple suspected that what was beginning would prove far more complex and deadly than anyone yet realized. The murderer had made one crucial error in their otherwise sophisticated plan. They had underestimated the power of small details to reveal large truths, and the ability of a seemingly harmless elderly lady to recognize the patterns that connected individual deceptions into a comprehensive picture of guilt. The discovery of Mrs. Ashworth's walking stick had transformed the investigation from a case of village scandal into something far more calculated and sinister. Miss Marple sat in her parlor that evening, the various pieces of evidence arranged on her side table with the same methodical precision she brought to her most complex knitting patterns. The blood-stained silver head, with its distinctive Ashworth family crest, seemed to watch her with malevolent patience as she considered the psychological profile emerging from each new revelation. Inspector Craddock arrived as the church clock struck 9, his weathered features reflecting the weight of forensic reports that raised more questions than they answered. The preliminary analysis had confirmed their suspicions about the weapon while revealing troubling details about the killer's methodology. The language of evidence. The laboratory confirms it was indeed the murder weapon, Inspector Craddock reported, settling into the chintz armchair with visible fatigue. But there are curious inconsistencies. The blood pattern suggests the weapon was cleaned thoroughly after the attack, then deliberately contaminated with fresh evidence, as though someone wanted to ensure its discovery, but only after a calculated interval. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythmic movement. Deliberately contaminated. That suggests our murderer possesses not only the psychological sophistication to manipulate Mrs. Ashworth, but also the technical knowledge to guide an investigation toward predetermined conclusions. The implications were deeply troubling. This was not a crime of passion, but of meticulous calculation, executed by someone who understood both human psychology and the mechanics of criminal investigation. The killer had anticipated each step of the official inquiry and prepared accordingly. The blotting paper's secrets. Inspector Craddock produced the blotting pad from the summer house, carefully wrapped in evidence cloth. I thought you might like another examination under better lighting. The station's illumination is rather institutional. Miss Marple adjusted her reading lamp and placed a fresh sheet over the violet ink impressions. With the gentle precision of someone creating a nature rubbing, she shaded lightly with a pencil, revealing fragments that read like overheard phrases from a private negotiation. Bring the act. Books. Explain before anyone sees. 4 o'clock. Do not be late. The handwriting beneath the shading was neat and slightly slanted, the sort of script associated with committee minutes and careful lists. The violet ink traces, though faint, were sufficient to suggest someone accustomed to conducting correspondence in that particular shade. Account books? Inspector Craddock repeated, his interest sharpening. Which accounts would warrant such urgency? In a village like Little Wickham, Miss Marple observed gently, such references typically concern either household ledgers, which a woman of Mrs. Ashworth's temperament would never allow others to handle, or the Church Restoration Fund accounts. They allowed this possibility to settle between them like dust in still air. The garden party had been organized for the Church Restoration Fund, with Mrs. Bellwether managing the financial arrangements with her characteristic efficiency. Miss Marple found herself recalling the vicar's wife's precise movements throughout the afternoon, her careful supervision of the tea service, and that curious moment when she had manufactured a medical emergency to detain Dr. Pemberton. Financial undercurrents. The following morning brought additional revelations about Mrs. Ashworth's increasingly complex financial situation. Mr. Trent, under more intensive questioning, revealed that her mysterious cash withdrawals had been accompanied by frequent inquiries about irregular arrangements and discretionary payments. The banker's professional discretion was beginning to crack under official pressure, though he maintained that client confidentiality prevented him from identifying the ultimate recipients of these funds. The amounts were substantial, Inspector Craddock reported, far exceeding normal household expenses and always collected in person by someone who never provided identification. The timing suggests systematic exploitation rather than occasional assistance. Miss Marple considered this information while examining the violet-stained dishcloth that Polly had discovered. The careful placement of evidence in the scullery suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the household's routines, someone who could move through service areas without attracting attention or suspicion. The Scullery Revelations. When Polly Meadows arrived at the cottage that afternoon, her nervous energy had transformed into something approaching determination. She carried a small bundle wrapped in brown paper, her young face reflecting the weight of discoveries that had clearly troubled her sleep. "I found these under the scullery shelf," she explained, unwrapping a pair of inexpensive gloves. "Mrs. Bellwether said they'd been left behind months ago, and I might have them, but they're not mine. They're too small for my hands, and there's something odd about them." Miss Marple examined the gloves with careful attention. Inside one cuff was a crescent-shaped stain of violet ink, the mark of someone who catches at their wrist when donning gloves hastily. More significantly, the other glove contained a fine, powdery residue in its seams that proved, when tested, to be granulated sugar. "The blue jar in the scullery," Polly continued, her voice gaining confidence. "When Mrs. Bellwether sent me to fetch more napkins, I was only gone a few minutes. When I returned, the jar was open, though no one was supposed to be using granulated sugar for the tea service." The detail seemed insignificant on its surface, yet Miss Marple recognized it as exactly the sort of small inconsistency that often revealed large truths. Someone had accessed the scullery's supplies with specific purpose, using the granulated sugar to stage evidence while wearing gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints. The pattern emerges. As evening shadows lengthened across Little Wickham, Miss Marple found herself considering the curious duality of their unknown murderer. The threatening letter had been crafted to suggest one type of personality, crude, desperate, masculine in its directness. Yet the actual execution of the crime revealed someone entirely different, methodical, sophisticated, and possessed of intimate knowledge about village routines and relationships. The violet ink communications painted a third picture entirely. Someone who could shift between threat and reassurance, who understood Mrs. Ashworth's character well enough to know which emotional approaches would prove most effective. This psychological flexibility suggested a person accustomed to managing complex social dynamics while maintaining multiple facades. Forensic confirmations, Inspector Craddock's evening report, brought additional technical details that further complicated their understanding of the crime. The soil samples from the walking stick matched earth from both the cedar walk and the kitchen garden, suggesting the weapon had been moved between locations during the staging process. More intriguingly, traces of a specific silver polish, the same brand used throughout Thornfield Manor, indicated someone with access to the household's maintenance supplies. "The height analysis confirms our earlier estimates," Inspector Craddock added. "The blow was delivered by someone between 5'4" and 5'10" tall, assuming a standard grip. That eliminates some suspects while implicating others." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The physical evidence was beginning to form a coherent picture of someone who moved with practiced efficiency through spaces they knew intimately, someone who could access household supplies, manipulate correspondence, and stage evidence with considerable sophistication. The village under scrutiny. As news of the ongoing investigation spread through Little Wickham's intricate social network, Miss Marple observed the subtle shifts in behavior that often accompanied the approach of truth. Mrs. Bellwether's movements had acquired a careful precision that spoke of someone conscious of being watched. Mr. Trent's banker's composure remained intact, but his hands moved frequently to his jacket pocket, seeking reassurance from some familiar object. Most revealing were the unguarded moments when people believed themselves unobserved. Dr. Pemberton's medical bag remained conspicuously absent, despite his earlier concerns about the heat affecting guests. James Thornbury's desperate search for a corkscrew at a tea party where no wine was served suggested someone whose nervousness was affecting his judgment. The approaching resolution. As Inspector Craddock prepared to return to Much Haddam for the evening, Miss Marple carefully arranged the evidence on her side table like components of an intricate pattern. The threatening letter, the violet ink impressions, the sugar-stained gloves, and the blood-stained walking stick formed a constellation of clues that was beginning to reveal its underlying design. "Tomorrow will bring more intensive interviews," Inspector Craddock observed. "The forensic evidence provides a solid foundation, but we need to understand the human motivations that drove someone to such elaborate deception." Miss Marple smiled with the gentle satisfaction of someone who sensed the approaching resolution of a complex puzzle. "Indeed, Inspector, though I suspect our murderer has made one crucial error in their otherwise sophisticated plan. They've underestimated the power of small details to reveal large truths and the ability of village memory to preserve information that individual participants might prefer to forget." The game, as the threatening letter had so dramatically declared, was indeed over. But what was beginning would prove far more complex than anyone yet suspected, involving not just murder, but the careful excavation of secrets that had been buried beneath Little Wickham's respectable surface for far longer than the previous afternoon's garden party. The morning brought with it that peculiar clarity that often accompanies the final stages of complex investigations, when scattered fragments of evidence begin to coalesce it into patterns that reveal both method and motive. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, the threatening letter propped against her marmalade pot, while she considered the psychological profile that had emerged from their discoveries. The killer possessed not only the sophistication to orchestrate elaborate deception, but also the intimate knowledge of village dynamics necessary to manipulate multiple participants simultaneously. Inspector Craddock arrived promptly at 9, his weathered features carrying the focused intensity of someone who sensed the approaching resolution of a particularly challenging case. The manila folder in his hands contained overnight reports from the pathologist in Much Haddam, though Miss Marple suspected that the most significant revelations would come from human observation rather than scientific analysis. The medical evidence. "The timing has been established with reasonable precision," Inspector Craddock reported, settling into the familiar chintz armchair. "Between 4:15 and 4:30 yesterday afternoon. Single blow to the occipital region, delivered with considerable force. No defensive wounds, which suggests Mrs. Ashworth had not turned to face her attacker." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythmic movement. "One doesn't turn one's back on a person one fears," she observed mildly. "Not unless one has been reassured or is accustomed to being reassured by that particular person." The summer house meeting was not a confrontation. It was a carefully orchestrated deception. The implications settled between them like morning mist, gradually solidifying into something more substantial. The violet ink communications had served their purpose, luring Mrs. Ashworth to her death with promises of explanation or reconciliation, while the threatening letter had provided misdirection about the killer's true identity and motivations. The vicarage revelations. Their first formal call was to the vicarage, where Mrs. Bellwether received them with her characteristic efficiency, though Miss Marple noted how her movements had acquired a careful precision that spoke of someone conscious of being observed. The Restoration Fund ledgers were produced with practiced ease, their neat columns and violet ink entries creating an impression of meticulous organization. "Everything is perfectly in order," Mrs. Bellwether explained, her voice carrying just a trace of defensiveness. Mrs. Ashworth was most particular about proper accounting procedures, and I naturally follow her example in all such matters. Miss Marple admired the penmanship while examining the violet ink more closely. "Such a pleasant color for correspondence," she remarked gently. "I suppose it shows up particularly well under artificial light." Mrs. Bellwether's glance flickered almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Trent recommended it for the committee work. He said black ink could be rather severe on the eyes during long evening sessions." As Inspector Craddock began his methodical questioning about the garden party proceeds and Mrs. Ashworth's interest in the accounts, Miss Marple observed the subtle signs of nervous tension that Mrs. Bellwether was working so hard to conceal. The vicar's wife had positioned herself near the hall table, where a pair of cream kid gloves lay with suspicious casualness. When Miss Marple lifted them with an apologetic murmur about admiring the quality, she noted the faint crescent of violet discoloration at one wrist and the barely visible sparkle of sugar crystals trapped in the seaming of the other. The banking connection. At the bank, Mr. Trent's professional composure remained intact, but his hands moved frequently to his jacket pocket, seeking reassurance from some familiar object. When pressed about Mrs. Ashworth's mysterious cash withdrawals, he maintained his position about client confidentiality while inadvertently revealing crucial details about the collection arrangements. The funds were always collected by someone described as a committee representative, he explained, his gaze sliding away from direct contact. "I never pressed for specific identification. One records disbursement, not destination in such charitable matters." Miss Marple observed how his fountain pen, when he nervously withdrew it to make notes, bore faint violet stains on its silver barrel. The Parker duofold was indeed a professional instrument, exactly the sort favored by those who conducted extensive correspondence and valued reliability over ornamentation. The pattern emerges. As the morning progressed, the evidence began forming a coherent picture of systematic embezzlement disguised as charitable administration. Mrs. Ashworth's growing suspicions about financial irregularities had posed an existential threat to years of careful manipulation, while her position as the primary donor made her elimination both necessary and strategically advantageous for the perpetrator. When Polly Meadows arrived at the cottage that afternoon, her nervous energy had transformed into something approaching resolution. The leather portfolio she carried contained correspondence that painted a devastating picture of financial manipulation extending back several years. The receipts for cash payments, signed only with the initials DB in violet ink, corresponded precisely to Mrs. Ashworth's mysterious withdrawals from the bank. "Mrs. Bellwether always uses violet ink," Polly confirmed when asked about the correspondence. "She says it's more feminine than black, and she has this rather fancy fountain pen with a silver cap shaped like an acorn. She's very particular about her writing materials." The psychological complexity. Miss Marple found herself considering the remarkable psychological sophistication required for such elaborate deception. Mrs. Bellwether had managed to maintain her reputation as the village's most reliable organizer while systematically exploiting the trust placed in her financial management. The threatening letter had been crafted to suggest masculine desperation, while the violet ink communications had employed feminine reassurance, a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate different aspects of Mrs. Ashworth's character. The Church Restoration Fund had provided the perfect vehicle for such activities, with large donations from wealthy parishioners, complex accounting requirements, and Mrs. Bellwether's unquestioned authority over financial arrangements. Her position as the vicar's wife offered an impeccable facade of respectability, while her organizational skills provided both opportunity and cover for systematic theft. The village under scrutiny. As news of the intensifying investigation spread through Little Wycombe's social network, Miss Marple observed the subtle shifts in behavior that often accompanied the approach of truth. Mrs. Bellwether's movements had acquired that careful precision she had noted earlier, while her responses to casual questions about village affairs had become notably guarded. Most revealing was the discovery of a handkerchief in the shrubbery near the cedar walk. Fine linen with the initials D.B. embroidered in one corner and a faint trace of violet ink along its edge. When confronted with this evidence, Mrs. Bellwether's explanation was perfectly reasonable, yet somehow too prepared, as though she had anticipated such discoveries. The approaching resolution. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the village, Miss Marple carefully arranged the various pieces of evidence on her side table like components of an intricate pattern. The threatening letter, the violet ink communications, the sugar-stained gloves, the blood-stained walking stick, and now the portfolio of incriminating correspondence formed a constellation of clues that revealed both method and motive with devastating clarity. "The evidence is compelling," Inspector Craddock observed, "though much remains circumstantial. We need something more definitive to ensure a conviction against someone of Mrs. Bellwether's standing in the community." Miss Marple smiled with the gentle satisfaction of someone who understood that the most sophisticated criminals often provided their own downfall through the very complexity of their deceptions. "Indeed, Inspector, though I suspect our murderer has made one crucial error in their otherwise meticulous planning. Tomorrow's parish meeting will provide the perfect opportunity to test a small theory about human nature and the power of habit to reveal truth." She rose and moved to her writing desk, where she composed a brief note on her personal stationery. The message was worded with the innocent domesticity that characterized all her correspondence, yet it carried implications that would prove devastating to one particular recipient who would understand its true meaning. The game, as the threatening letter had so dramatically declared, was indeed over. But what was about to begin would require all of Miss Marple's understanding of human psychology to expose a clever murderer who had spent years perfecting the art of manipulation within the very heart of Little Wickham's most trusted institutions. The afternoon sun continued to slant through her cottage windows, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow that seemed to mirror the complex interplay of truth and deception that had characterized the most audacious crime in the village's peaceful history. The morning following Miss Marple's careful arrangement of evidence dawned with that peculiar clarity that often accompanies the final stages of complex investigations. The village of Little Wickham stirred to life with an undercurrent of tension that seemed to permeate every conversation, every glance exchanged across garden gates. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, composing what appeared to be an innocuous note on her personal cream-colored stationery, though she understood that its recipient would recognize the implications with devastating clarity. The strategic communication. The note, written in her characteristic blue-black ink, carried the gentle tone of village correspondence while delivering a message that would test years of carefully constructed deception. "Dear Mrs. Bellwether, I wonder if you might spare a moment after this afternoon's parish meeting to discuss some interesting observations about the Restoration Fund correspondence. The violet ink entries have caught my attention, and I'm certain you can provide clarification. Most gratefully, Jane Marple." She sealed the envelope with methodical precision, knowing that the psychological pressure of anticipated exposure often proved more revealing than direct confrontation. In her considerable experience, sophisticated criminals possessed remarkable composure when facing expected challenges, but their carefully maintained facades often developed telling cracks when confronted with evidence they had not anticipated being preserved or examined so closely. The village responds. By mid-morning, the note had been delivered to the vicarage, and Miss Marple observed from her cottage window the subtle changes in routine that followed. Mrs. Bellwether's usual efficient movements around her garden had acquired a careful precision that spoke of someone conscious of being watched. When she emerged to collect her morning post, her glance toward Miss Marple's cottage lingered just a moment too long, and her usual cheerful wave carried a stiffness that suggested considerable mental preparation for the afternoon's encounter. The parish meeting, scheduled for 2:30, would provide the perfect stage for what Miss Marple suspected would be the final act of their investigation. The church hall, with its familiar arrangement of wooden chairs and committee tables, would transform from a venue for village administration into something altogether more significant, a place where carefully buried truths would finally surface under the gentle but relentless pressure of accumulated evidence. The parish meeting unfolds. The afternoon gathering filled the church hall with an atmosphere that seemed charged with unspoken tension. Mrs. Bellwether presided over the Restoration Fund presentation with her characteristic efficiency, her violet fountain pen moving across ledger pages with practiced authority as she detailed expenditures and projected costs. Yet Miss Marple, observing from her usual seat near the front, noted the subtle signs of strain that no amount of social training could entirely conceal. "The committee has managed the donations with exemplary care," Mrs. Bellwether announced to the assembled parishioners, her voice carrying its usual authority, though perhaps with a trace more emphasis than strictly necessary. "Every contribution has been properly recorded, and I'm pleased to report excellent progress toward our restoration goals." Inspector Craddock sat discreetly at the back of the hall, his presence serving as a quiet reminder of the serious business that lay beneath the afternoon's administrative proceedings. His weathered features remained impassive, though Miss Marple caught the slight nod he gave when Mrs. Bellwether produced her violet fountain pen, the same distinctive instrument they had discussed in their evening conferences. The psychological pressure. As the formal business concluded and tea was served from the familiar arrangement of china and silver, Miss Marple approached Mrs. Bellwether with the gentle directness that characterized all her social interactions. The vicar's wife received her with apparent warmth, though something in her eyes suggested she had been anticipating this particular conversation throughout the afternoon's proceedings. "I do hope my note didn't cause you any undue concern," Miss Marple began, accepting a cup of tea with her customary graciousness. "It's just that I've been reviewing some old correspondence, and I noticed such interesting patterns in the committee records spanning several years." Mrs. Bellwether's response carried perfect social composure, yet Miss Marple observed the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes that spoke of someone steeling themselves for a difficult encounter. "Of course, Miss Marple, I'm always happy to clarify any questions about fund management. Proper accountability is so essential in charitable work." "Indeed it is," Miss Marple agreed, her tone maintaining that gentle conversational quality that had disarmed countless suspects over the years. "I've been particularly intrigued by the violet ink entries. Such a distinctive choice, and so consistently applied across multiple years of documentation." The evidence emerges. Miss Marple's handbag yielded a manila folder containing documents that painted a devastating picture of systematic manipulation disguised as charitable administration. Bank withdrawal, slips bearing Mrs. Ashworth's distinctive signature, matched with receipt acknowledgments initialed DB in unmistakable violet ink. Committee minutes detailing fictional expenditures that corresponded precisely to the mysterious cash payments Mr. Trent had reluctantly disclosed under official questioning. "The penmanship throughout these documents is quite remarkable," Miss Marple observed, with genuine admiration for the technical skill involved. "Someone clearly invested considerable time in studying Mrs. Ashworth's writing style, though I notice certain subtle differences that become apparent under careful examination." Mrs. Bellwether examined the evidence with a sort of careful attention that suggested she was calculating possibilities rather than experiencing genuine surprise. Her violet fountain pen remained in her hand, though Miss Marple noted how her fingers moved restlessly across its familiar silver surface, a nervous habit that betrayed the strain of maintaining composure under such circumstances. The psychological breakthrough. "You know," Miss Marple continued in her most conversational tone, "what troubles me most about yesterday's tragic events isn't the dramatic elements, the threatening letter, or the staged confrontation. It's the small details that reveal so much about human nature and careful planning." She paused to sip her tea, allowing the silence to extend just long enough to create psychological pressure without appearing deliberately confrontational. The sugar crystals in Mrs. Ashworth's teacup, for instance. Such a curious detail for someone who never took sugar in her tea. Almost as though someone wanted to create the impression of nervousness or agitation without understanding that such a fundamental change in habit would be immediately noticed by those who knew her well. Mrs. Bellwether's composure began showing visible signs of strain. Her breathing had become slightly more rapid, and a faint flush was beginning to rise from her collar toward her carefully powdered cheeks. Perhaps in the confusion of the afternoon, Polly made an error in the tea service, she suggested, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed gently. Though Polly was quite certain about the details, including the violet ink stains on the dishcloth she discovered in the scullery. Such an unusual coincidence, given Mrs. Ashworth's well-known preference for blue-black fountain pen ink. The final pressure. The mention of the violet ink evidence created a visible shift in Mrs. Bellwether's demeanor. Her carefully maintained facade began developing the sort of hairline cracks that spoke of enormous internal pressure seeking release. Miss Marple observed these changes with the compassionate understanding of someone who recognized the terrible burden of maintaining such elaborate deception over extended periods. "I suspect," Miss Marple continued with infinite gentleness, "that Mrs. Ashworth had begun asking uncomfortable questions about the Restoration Fund accounts. The sort of detailed inquiries that would require producing original invoices and contractor agreements, documents that might prove difficult to locate for projects that existed primarily on paper." Mrs. Bellwether's response came as barely more than a whisper. She was becoming suspicious, asking to review everything personally, mentioning independent audits. The admission seemed to escape against her will, as though the psychological pressure had finally found a weakness in her carefully constructed defenses. The truth emerges. What followed unfolded with the inexorable quality that Miss Marple had observed in countless previous cases, where the accumulated weight of evidence and psychological pressure finally overwhelmed even the most sophisticated attempts at deception. Mrs. Bellwether's confession emerged in carefully measured phrases, each admission revealing another layer of the elaborate scheme that had made Mrs. Ashworth's death seem inevitable to someone who had spent years building a criminal enterprise on the foundation of village trust. The financial manipulation had indeed been systematic and sophisticated, using the Restoration Fund as a vehicle for embezzlement while maintaining the perfect facade of charitable dedication. The threatening letter had been designed to create misdirection about the killer's identity, while the violet ink communications had served to manipulate Mrs. Ashworth's responses, with carefully crafted appeals to different aspects of her character. As Inspector Craddock moved forward to make the formal arrest, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the remarkable psychological complexity that had enabled such elaborate deception within the heart of Little Wycombe's most trusted institutions. The case demonstrated once again how the most dangerous criminals often operated not through dramatic gestures, but through the patient exploitation of social trust and the careful manipulation of human psychology. The game, as the threatening letter had so dramatically declared, was indeed over, but the truth that emerged proved far more complex and disturbing than anyone had initially suspected, revealing how easily the bonds of village trust could be exploited by someone who understood both human nature and the mechanics of social manipulation with such devastating precision. The confession did not unfold with the neat finality that Inspector Craddock's forward movement might have suggested. Mrs. Bellwether's carefully measured words acknowledged years of systematic embezzlement, her violet fountain pen trembling slightly as she set it aside. Yet when the conversation turned to the summer house meeting, something shifted in her demeanor. The resignation in her voice gave way to a vehemence that startled even those who had known her for decades. "I arranged to meet Mrs. Ashworth." "Yes," she said, her hands clasping and unclasping in her lap. "I meant to explain, to show her fabricated accounts that would buy me time until I could replace what I had taken. But murder, no. At 4 o'clock, I was rooted to the tea urn, managing the sticky tap and directing Polly about the last of the cucumber sandwiches. There were witnesses. The room seemed to exhale collectively, the certainty of resolution suddenly dissolving into something far more complex. Miss Marple observed how several faces in the assembled group registered not relief, but a different kind of tension, as though Mrs. Bellwether's denial had opened a door that some had hoped would remain closed. Inspector Craddock's weathered features reflected the professional frustration of someone whose carefully constructed case had developed an unexpected complication. Yet Miss Marple noted with interest how his gaze had begun to shift, moving from Mrs. Bellwether to other faces in the room with the methodical attention of someone reconsidering established assumptions. "The embezzlement is clear enough," Mrs. Bellwether continued, her voice gaining strength from the admission of lesser guilt. "I use my position, my access to the accounts, my reputation for reliability. Mrs. Ashworth trusted me completely, and I betrayed that trust systematically over several years. But I never intended violence. The threatening letter was meant to frighten her into silence, nothing more." As she spoke, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small commotion near the tea table, where Polly Meadows was gathering the remaining crockery with trembling hands. The girl's nervousness had intensified rather than diminished with Mrs. Bellwether's partial confession, and when an envelope slipped from beneath her tea-cloth to flutter toward the floor, Miss Marple moved with characteristic efficiency to retrieve it. The cream-colored paper bore the familiar weight and watermark of Thornfield Manor stationery, but the handwriting was bold and black, utterly different from the violet ink entries that had characterized Mrs. Bellwether's correspondence. The message inside was brief and brutal in its directness. "Keep to what you said. You saw nothing by the Cedar Walk. You heard the vicar's wife call for more sugar at 10 to 4. Remember that." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully into her handbag, her mind already connecting this new evidence to the pattern of manipulation that extended beyond Mrs. Bellwether's financial crimes. Someone else had been orchestrating events, using the embezzlement as leverage while pursuing their own deadly agenda. "Polly, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if you might tell us about the timing yesterday afternoon. You mentioned hearing Mrs. Bellwether call for sugar. When exactly was that?" The girl's face went pale, her eyes darting between Mrs. Bellwether and the other assembled parishioners. It was just before 4 o'clock, Miss Marple. Maybe 10 minutes before. Mrs. Bellwether was very particular about having enough sugar for the late tea service. The alibi was neat, precisely timed, and utterly convenient for someone who needed Mrs. Bellwether's presence at the tea urn, confirmed during the crucial period. Miss Marple observed how several people in the room seemed to relax slightly at this confirmation, though one face remained carefully impassive. Mr. Oliver Trent had positioned himself near the window throughout the afternoon's proceedings, his banker's composure intact despite the dramatic revelations. When Miss Marple's gaze settled on him with apparent casualness, she noted how his hand moved instinctively to his jacket pocket, where the outline of a fountain pen was clearly visible. "Mr. Trent," Miss Marple said with her characteristic gentleness, "I wonder if you might help clarify something about the Restoration Fund accounts. The abbreviations in some of the correspondence have caught my attention." His response was perfectly measured, professionally appropriate, yet something in the slight tightening around his eyes suggested that Miss Marple's seemingly innocent request had struck a nerve. When he produced his notebook to jot down her address for a future appointment, his pen moved with swift efficiency, automatically abbreviating account to act. In the margin, exactly the sort of unconscious habit that had appeared in the violet ink impressions on the summer-house blotting paper. The pattern was becoming clear with devastating precision. Mrs. Bellwether's embezzlement had provided the perfect cover for someone else's more deadly agenda. The threatening letters, the carefully orchestrated meeting, the precise timing of alibis, all pointed to someone who understood both the mechanics of financial crime and the psychology of village relationships with sophisticated precision. As Inspector Craddock began to piece together this new dimension of the case, Miss Marple found herself considering the remarkable complexity of a crime that had used one person's guilt to conceal another's, far more serious offense. The Restoration Fund scandal would indeed rock Little Wickham's foundations, but the murder of Mrs. Ashworth represented something far more calculated and cold-blooded than financial desperation. The afternoon shadows were lengthening across the church hall's windows, casting patterns that seemed to shift and change like the evidence itself. Mrs. Bellwether sat in stunned silence, realizing that her confession had not brought the resolution she had expected, but had instead opened the door to revelations that would prove far more devastating to the village's carefully maintained social order. Miss Marple carefully arranged her knitting, her mind already working through the final steps necessary to expose a murderer who had used financial crime as both motive and camouflage. The game, as that first threatening letter had declared, was indeed over, but the player who had written those words was about to discover that Miss Marple understood the rules far better than they had anticipated. The church hall had emptied with the subdued efficiency that follows shocking revelations, leaving behind only the core participants in what Miss Marple increasingly understood to be a far more complex crime than anyone had initially suspected. Mrs. Bellwether's confession to embezzlement had provided crucial information, yet her adamant denial of murder had opened pathways that led directly to the one person whose professional expertise could have orchestrated such sophisticated deception. Miss Marple observed Mr. Oliver Trent as he lingered near the committee table, ostensibly reviewing the financial documents that had exposed Mrs. Bellwether's crimes. His banker's composure remained intact, yet she noted how his hand moved with increasing frequency to his jacket pocket, seeking reassurance from the familiar weight of his fountain pen. The violet ink stains on its silver barrel had become more than mere evidence. They were a signature of guilt written in the most permanent medium of all. The cottage trap. That evening, Miss Marple sent a simple message to Mr. Trent through one of the vicarage boys. Could he possibly spare a few minutes to advise her about some banking abbreviations in older parish records? The request carried the innocent domesticity that characterized all her correspondence, yet she understood that its recipient would recognize both the courtesy and the implicit command that village etiquette demanded he honor. He arrived precisely at the appointed time, carrying his professional demeanor like a well-tailored coat that had served him faithfully through years of managing other people's financial affairs. Polly Meadows was present by arrangement with Inspector Craddock, ostensibly to help with tea service, but actually to provide the witness testimony that would prove crucial to their final resolution. "Such a kindness, Mr. Trent," Miss Marple said with her characteristic gentleness as she settled him in the familiar chintz armchair. "It's merely a matter of abbreviations, really. My eyes aren't quite what they once were, and I thought perhaps you might help clarify some of the older committee shorthand for my records." She placed a folder and blotting pad on the low table between them, the paper bearing the familiar watermark of quality stationery. With the apologetic manner of someone conscious of imposing on a busy professional's time, she asked if he would be so kind as to jot down the modern equivalents for some faded entries. Mr. Trent produced his fountain pen without the slightest hesitation, unscrewing the cap with the practiced motion of someone who had performed this action thousands of times. When the nib touched paper, violet ink blossomed with the precise shade that Inspector Craddock's constables had been collecting in fragments throughout their investigation. "Act, if you please," Miss Marple requested, pointing to an old entry. "I know the abbreviation, of course, but one cannot be too certain when other eyes will examine these records." His hand responded before his mind could intervene, forming the notation with swift efficiency, the C's tight and economical, the T crossed with a decisive rightward stroke, the small flourish where the nib lifted from paper. The handwriting matched exactly the impressions they had discovered on the summer-house blotting paper, revealing not just method but the unconscious habits that no amount of careful planning could entirely disguise. The accumulating evidence, As they worked through various abbreviations, Miss Marple observed how Mr. Trent's composure began developing subtle cracks under the pressure of performing familiar actions while knowing they were being scrutinized. When Polly set down the tea service, including a small bowl of granulated sugar crystals that seemed oddly out of place beside the proper sugar lumps, his glance flickered toward it with the sort of recognition that spoke of intimate familiarity. "I had thought, initially," Miss Marple continued in her most conversational tone, "that the most distressing aspect of yesterday's events would be the crude nature of that threatening letter. But one learns to look beyond surface impressions to see method, Mr. Trent. Method fascinates me far more than melodrama." She paused to examine his handwriting sample with the attention she might give to a complex knitting pattern. The way a careful person writes, for instance. Abbreviations become second nature, don't they? The way a methodical person replaces objects almost exactly where they found them, though almost, is often the most revealing word in such circumstances. His laugh carried perfect social appropriateness, yet something in its forced quality suggested considerable internal strain. "You have me at a disadvantage, Miss Marple. I've always prided myself on being methodical in figures, though perhaps less so in other areas." "Oh, but you're quite methodical in everything, Mr. Trent," she replied with gentle certainty. "I've been considering that glass paperweight in the summer house, you see. It wasn't positioned as a careless person would have left it, but rather as someone had carefully replaced it to appear undisturbed. The precision of that placement spoke of someone who couldn't bear for things to look haphazard, even evidence of a crime. The broader conspiracy. As the evening progressed, Miss Marple's gentle questioning revealed the true scope of the financial manipulation that had made Mrs. Ashworth's death seem inevitable to someone whose criminal enterprise extended far beyond the Church Restoration Fund. The embezzlement had indeed served as perfect camouflage, but the stakes were considerably higher than village charity accounts. Mrs. Ashworth wasn't merely discovering Mrs. Bellwether's petty theft, Miss Marple observed, her knitting needles moving with steady precision. She was uncovering irregularities in the larger trust accounts, the investment portfolios, the estate management fees that only someone with your professional access could manipulate so systematically. The accusation hung in the cottage's comfortable atmosphere like morning mist gradually solidifying into something more substantial. Mr. Trent's hand moved to his jacket pocket with unconscious seeking, and when he withdrew his handkerchief to address the perspiration that had begun forming on his forehead, the gesture revealed a small violet ink stain on his shirt cuff, evidence of hasty pen wiping that professional caution had failed to prevent. The confession. "You see," Miss Marple continued with infinite gentleness, "the difficulty with your otherwise admirable plan was that it required you to be unlike yourself in crucial moments. The threatening letter was crafted to suggest masculine desperation, yet your natural precision kept showing through. The violet ink communications were designed to reassure Mrs. Ashworth, but they carried the same abbreviated efficiency that characterizes all your professional correspondence." She lifted the blotting paper with careful precision, revealing once again the faint impressions that had first caught her attention. One cannot help being oneself, even in the commission of crimes. That is both the tragedy and the justice of human nature. Polly's voice, when it came, carried the steady strength of someone who had finally found the courage to speak truth. "He told me to remember about Mrs. Bellwether calling for sugar at 10 minutes to 4. He said it was important that everyone understood she was busy with the tea service at exactly that time. But it was him who put the note under my tea cloth, telling me what to say." The confession that followed emerged not through dramatic confrontation, but through the inexorable weight of accumulated evidence and psychological pressure. Mr. Trent's professional facade cracked like ice under spring sun, revealing the desperate calculations that had led him to transform financial crime into murder when Mrs. Ashworth's growing suspicions threatened to expose years of systematic theft. "She wanted independent audits," he said, his voice carrying the exhausted quality of someone who had finally stopped running from inevitable consequences. Original invoices, contractor agreements, detailed reviews of every transaction spanning several years. The embezzlement was merely the visible portion. Beneath it lay investment diversions, trust fund manipulations, estate fee inflations that would have destroyed not just my career, but my freedom. The method revealed. The murder itself had been orchestrated with the same professional precision that had characterized his financial crimes. The threatening letter had forced the confrontation while creating misdirection about the killer's identity. The violet ink communications had manipulated Mrs. Ashworth into compliance, using her trust and professional expertise to lure her to the summer house meeting that would prove fatal. I wrote to her twice, Mr. Trent continued, his confession emerging with the methodical quality that had characterized all his professional work. The threat in black ink to force the meeting, then reassurance in violet to ensure she would come alone and unsuspecting. She turned her back to retrieve the account books I had told her to bring. That was when I struck with her own walking stick. The staging had been equally calculated. The cleaned weapon hidden where routine maintenance would eventually discover it. The sugar crystals planted to suggest Mrs. Bellwether's nervous carelessness. The careful repositioning of the glass paperweight to maintain the illusion of an undisturbed scene. As Inspector Craddock moved forward to make the formal arrest, Miss Marple reflected on the remarkable sophistication of a crime that had used one person's guilt to conceal another's far more deadly agenda. The Restoration Fund scandal would indeed rock Little Wickham's foundations, but Mr. Trent's systematic exploitation of village trust represented something far more disturbing, the cold-blooded manipulation of an entire community's financial security by someone who understood both human psychology and institutional authority with devastating precision. The evening deepened around her cottage as the last act of their investigation concluded, leaving behind only the familiar rhythm of her knitting needles and the satisfaction of a complex pattern finally revealed in all its intricate completeness. The game, as that first threatening letter had so dramatically declared, was indeed over, but the truth that emerged proved far more complex and chilling than anyone had initially suspected. The arrest of Mr. Oliver Trent unfolded with the quiet dignity that Inspector Craddock brought to all his professional duties. Yet the cottage seemed to exhale with relief as the handcuffs appeared as simply as putting away a fountain pen. Trent looked around Miss Marple's parlor with the same careful attention he had devoted to ledgers and balances throughout his career, seeing everything and grasping, perhaps for the first time, how the smallest details had undone his elaborate deception. He did not resist when the constables led him away, his professional composure finally crumbling under the weight of complete exposure. Polly Meadows remained in the cottage after the official proceedings concluded, her young face reflecting the complex mixture of relief and guilt that accompanies the revelation of long-carried secrets. The threatening note that had instructed her false testimony lay open on Miss Marple's side table, its crude commands serving as stark evidence of how thoroughly Mr. Trent had manipulated the village's most vulnerable residents to support his fiction. I knew it was wrong to lie about the timing, Polly confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. But he made it sound like I was protecting Mrs. Bellwether, not helping him cover up murder. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their familiar rhythm as she considered the psychological sophistication required for such manipulation. He was very clever about using people's better instincts against them, my dear. Mrs. Bellwether's embezzlement provided perfect camouflage for his more serious crimes, because it made her desperate to avoid scrutiny. Your kindness toward her made you vulnerable to his manipulation. Even Mrs. Ashworth's trust in professional expertise became the means of her destruction. The village awakens to truth. The morning brought the inevitable tide of village reaction that spread like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. News of Mr. Trent's arrest traveled across garden fences and through the queue at the grocer's, carried by Mrs. Price Ridley with less than her usual relish for scandal. The banker who had shaken hands at charity fetes and advised thrift at Mothers' Union meetings had proved to be both thief and killer, a revelation that left the village speaking more softly than usual, as though in a church where one had seen a candle flare unexpectedly and scorch the altar cloth. The full scope of Mr. Trent's financial crimes would take weeks to unravel, as Inspector Craddock's investigations revealed systematic manipulation extending far beyond the Church Restoration Fund. Estate management fees had been inflated, investment returns diverted, trust fund distributions delayed through a complex network that demonstrated years of careful planning. Mrs. Ashworth's growing suspicions had threatened not just exposure, but complete financial ruin for someone whose entire reputation had been built on the foundation of village trust. Mrs. Bellwether, facing her own charges for embezzlement, was now seen in a different light, still guilty of theft, but also a victim of manipulation by someone far more calculating. The village, in its peculiar way, found itself almost forgiving her lesser sin, understanding how her desperation had been weaponized by a master manipulator. The art of detection explained. When Dolly Bantry arrived that afternoon with her characteristic appetite for understanding, she settled beneath the familiar copper beech with the determination of someone who would not be satisfied with surface explanations. "Craddock says it's all tied up properly now," Dolly announced. "But what I want to know is how you spotted it from the first, Jane. Was it really just the teacup?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with gentle amusement. "Oh no, Dolly dear. One never sees it complete at once. One notices incongruities and stores them away like pieces of a puzzle. The letter in the teacup was crude, too crude for someone of Mrs. Ashworth's circle. It wished to be seen, which is rarely the way with genuine threats. The important communication would have been the one we didn't find initially. Polite, businesslike, reassuring. When Mrs. Ashworth set out at 4 o'clock, she believed she was going to a meeting, not a confrontation. And the sugar crystals? A man who thinks in balances and professional appearances believes life consists of substitutable details. One piece of evidence for another, all pointing towards someone he intended us to suspect. But people are not ledger entries, my dear. Mrs. Bellwether would never have tampered with Mrs. Ashworth's personal cup at a public gathering. She hoarded her orderliness too dearly. And Mr. Trent could not help replacing that glass paperweight with professional precision, even when staging evidence of a crime. Bad men are often betrayed by their virtues as much as their vices. Miss Marple paused to examine her knitting pattern with the same attention she had given to the case's evidence. The violet ink was particularly revealing once we understood its significance. Mr. Trent had recommended it to the committee, then used it himself with such professional neatness that his abbreviated handwriting betrayed him completely. One cannot escape one's own habits, even in the commission of murder. Character resolutions and village healing. James Thornbury, who had inherited not only a house bereft of its mistress but finances entangled by someone else's crimes, came to Miss Marple with the chastened air of a man who had measured the world by his wants and found it possessed measuring rods of its own. "I was beastly that afternoon," he confessed, as she poured tea into the cornflower spode, without sugar. "Wanted what I couldn't be trusted with. Aunt Venetia was right not to alter the settlement. Now it's beyond alteration." "You may yet alter other things," Miss Marple observed gently. "If I may suggest, you might begin with the roof of St. Jude's. Broken tiles, like broken tempers, create drafts that chill everyone." Dr. Pemberton, cleared of all suspicion except excessive kindness, found excuses to walk the post office route when Polly Meadows posted letters. The village watched with gentle approval, understanding that some good might yet emerge from the tragedy's aftermath. Reflections on human nature. As evening approached and Inspector Craddock made his final visit to discuss the case's resolution, Miss Marple reflected on the curious satisfaction that accompanied the solving of complex human puzzles. The case had demonstrated once again how the most dangerous criminals often operated not through dramatic gestures, but through patient exploitation of social trust and institutional authority. It was the misdirection that nearly succeeded. Inspector Craddock observed, spreading the final photographs across her small table. The crude letter, the violet ink pointing toward Mrs. Bellwether, the planted evidence, all designed to use one person's guilt to conceal far more serious crimes. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, her needles moving with steady precision. Mr. Trent understood that suspicion adheres best when it finds familiar surfaces. The village already credited Mrs. Bellwether with remarkable energy and control. A little violet ink here, a strategically placed handkerchief there, and whispered instructions to a nervous girl about timing. It all transformed long-standing admiration into readiness to believe the worst. She glanced toward the window where the summer house at Thornfield Manor stood white and still at the end of its cedar walk. Mrs. Ashworth was a formidable woman who deserved better than to have her trust used as the instrument of her destruction. But perhaps some good will come of it. The village has learned to look more carefully at the small details that reveal large truths. The pattern complete. As the church clock struck 6:30 and the last light filtered through the copper beech, Little Wickham settled into the comfortable rhythms of evening. Life, which had been so dramatically interrupted, resumed its unassuming course, though with a new awareness of how easily the foundations of trust could be undermined by those who understood both human psychology and institutional authority. Miss Marple folded her knitting at the precise end of a row, her gaze wandering over the village she loved, a place of committees and kindnesses, quarrels and charitable endeavors, where human nature displayed itself without shame or artifice. The case had reminded her once again that evil often preferred tidy surfaces, hoping to pass for righteousness by being merely exact in its deceptions. The threatening letter that had begun their investigation lay in her bureau drawer, its crude ultimatum now revealed as merely one component in a far more sophisticated campaign of manipulation and murder. The game, as it had so dramatically declared, was indeed over, but the truth that emerged had proven far more complex and chilling than anyone had initially suspected, demonstrating how the most respectable facades could conceal the most calculating forms of criminal behavior. In the gathering dusk, with the familiar sounds of village, evening surrounding her cottage, Miss Marple understood that there would always be more patterns to observe, more small details that revealed the intricate and often startling truth of human nature. It was enough to understand it clearly, to forgive it where possible, and where forgiveness was not possible, to ensure that justice, however gentle its methods, would ultimately prevail. The weeks that followed Mr. Trent's arrest brought to Little Wickham the peculiar quality of convalescence that accompanies the exposure of long-concealed wounds. Miss Marple observed from her cottage window as the village gradually absorbed the full implications of what had transpired beneath its peaceful surface, noting how trust, once freely given, had become a commodity to be carefully weighed and measured. Inspector Craddock's final visit brought resolution to the technical mysteries that had puzzled them throughout the investigation. Settling into the familiar chintz armchair with visible satisfaction, he addressed the question that had lingered since Polly's initial discovery. "One small point that's been troubling me, Miss Marple," he began, producing the cracked cornflower, spode teacup from his evidence case. The letter in the teacup. How exactly did he manage to place it under the tea leaves? Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythmic movement as she smiled with gentle satisfaction. "Oh, quite simply, Inspector. He placed the note in the empty cup before any tea had touched it. Polly told us that Mrs. Ashworth's personal spode was always kept separate on the tray, reserved for her exclusive use. When Mrs. Bellwether struggled with that sticky tea urn at 10 minutes to 4, Mr. Trent's helpful nature provided the perfect opportunity. She lifted the delicate cup with careful precision, examining the hairline crack that ran along its rim. He couldn't resist making things orderly, you see. While appearing to assist with the mechanical difficulty, he restacked several cups, including Mrs. Ashworth's spode. The folded note slipped into the clean, empty cup took only seconds, and when hot tea was poured over it minutes later, the leaves settled naturally on top, concealing it completely. Inspector Craddock nodded with professional appreciation. And the crack itself? Provided the perfect excuse for removing the cup from circulation before anyone could examine it closely in company, Miss Marple observed. A small accident during the clearing up, requiring the cup to be wrapped in a cloth. The same violet-stained dishcloth he had used to clean his fountain pen at the summer house. Even in staging evidence, he couldn't help being methodical. The broader reckoning. The financial investigations revealed a scope of betrayal that extended far beyond the Church Restoration Fund, encompassing nearly a decade of systematic manipulation across multiple trust accounts and estate portfolios. The total amount approached £30,000, with Mrs. Ashworth's estate alone compromised by nearly £8,000 in diverted investment returns and inflated management fees. The bank in Much Haddam instituted new oversight procedures requiring dual signatures on all trust transactions and independent audits of estate management. Similar reform spread across the region as financial institutions grappled with the realization that professional credentials and social respectability provided insufficient protection against determined criminals. Mrs. Bellwether, facing her own legal consequences for embezzlement, found herself in the curious position of being both perpetrator and victim. The village's response to her situation reflected a complex understanding that her guilt, while inexcusable, had been weaponized by someone far more calculating. Her genuine remorse and cooperation with authorities earned a measure of community sympathy that would have been impossible had her crimes stood alone. Character transformations. Polly Meadows had discovered unexpected strength through her role as key witness against Mr. Trent's manipulation. The nervous girl who had found the threatening letter had transformed into someone who understood the importance of speaking truth regardless of personal consequences. When she announced her acceptance of a position as companion to an elderly lady in the neighboring village, the decision represented both escape and growth. "I keep thinking about how he made lying seem like kindness," she confided to Miss Marple during their final afternoon conversation. "He told me I was protecting Mrs. Bellwether by confirming her presence at the tea urn, when really I was helping him establish an alibi for murder. It makes one examine every assumption about helping others." Dr. Pemberton's growing attention to Polly's welfare had provided emotional support during the difficult weeks of testimony, and Miss Marple observed their developing relationship with gentle approval. Some good might yet emerge from tragedy's aftermath. James Thornbury, inheriting an estate compromised by another man's crimes, had surprised everyone by dedicating himself to understanding and rectifying the financial damage. His earlier desperation for immediate inheritance had been replaced by sobering appreciation for the responsibilities that accompanied family wealth. The roof repairs at St. Jude's, funded from his own resources, served as both practical necessity and symbolic gesture of commitment to the community his aunt had served so faithfully. Justice and its aftermath. The legal proceedings moved with methodical precision, drawing reporters from beyond the county borders as the full extent of Mr. Trent's financial machinations became public. His conviction brought formal closure, though the village's own process of healing required something beyond legal justice. The annual flower show proceeded with fewer entries and subdued atmosphere, while the Church Restoration Fund began rebuilding under careful new oversight. Life possessed an insistent rhythm, and Little Wickham, like any wounded organism, slowly began to heal, though with fresh layers of wariness coating every social interaction. Miss Marple's final reflections. As autumn settled over the village, bringing familiar rhythms of harvest and preparation for winter, Miss Marple found herself considering the psychological sophistication that had enabled such elaborate deception. The case had demonstrated how easily institutional trust could be exploited by those who understood both human psychology and professional authority with devastating precision. It was not the dramatic elements that made this case so dangerous, she reflected to Inspector Craddock during his farewell visit. Mr. Trent understood that the most effective crimes are committed not through grand gestures, but through patient exploitation of the very virtues that make community life possible. Trust, routine, the assumption that professional competence implies moral character. She glanced toward Thornfield Manor, where the summer house stood white and innocent in the afternoon light, its Gothic windows no longer seeming to watch with malevolent patience. Mrs. Ashworth deserved better than to have her trust used as the instrument of her destruction. But perhaps some good will come of it. The village has learned to examine more carefully the small details that reveal large truths about human nature. The pattern complete. As evening approached and the familiar sounds of village life resumed their comfortable rhythm, Miss Marple understood that Little Wickham would carry forward both wisdom and wariness from its encounter with sophisticated evil. The threatening letter that had begun their investigation now served as evidence in criminal proceedings. Its crude ultimatum revealed as merely one component in a far more elaborate campaign of manipulation and murder. The game, as it had so dramatically declared, was indeed over. But the truth that emerged had proven far more complex and instructive than anyone had initially suspected, demonstrating once again how the most dangerous criminals often operated through patient exploitation of social trust rather than dramatic violence. The village would recover, as villages always do, absorbing the shock and examining it in committee, bringing sandwiches to those who suffered, and mending what could be mended. The unmendable portions would be kept in memory's careful drawer, opened only when someone trustworthy needed reminding that beneath even the most respectable surfaces, human nature remained as complex and potentially dangerous as it was capable of unexpected virtue. In her cottage beneath the copper beech, Miss Marple folded her knitting at the precise end of a row, satisfied that another pattern had been completed, another mystery resolved through careful observation of the small details that revealed the intricate truth of human behavior. There would always be more patterns to observe, more mysteries to solve, but for now, Little Wickham could rest in the knowledge that justice, however gentle its methods, had ultimately prevailed over the most sophisticated forms of deception. The weeks that followed Mr. Trent's arrest brought to Little Wickham that peculiar quality of convalescence that accompanies the exposure of long-concealed wounds. Miss Marple observed from her cottage window as autumn settled over the village with its familiar palette of russet and gold, noting how the changing seasons seemed to mirror the community's gradual transformation from shock to acceptance to cautious renewal. The final reckonings, the funeral service for Mrs. Venetia Ashworth, took place on a crisp October morning when the light slanted through St. Jude's ancient windows with cathedral clarity. The church filled with faces that had aged perceptibly during the intervening months, reflecting not just grief for their lost neighbor, but a deeper understanding of how completely they had misjudged the dangers that could flourish beneath respectability's careful surface. The Reverend Mr. Clement spoke of stewardship and trust without naming either sin or sinner, his words carrying the weight of someone who had watched his own wife's reputation crumble while a more calculating evil went undetected. In the front pew, James Thornbury sat with the composed dignity of someone who had finally learned what inheritance truly meant, while behind him Mrs. Bellwether kept her veil lowered in the attitude of genuine penitence. The will reading at the solicitor's office in Much Haddam revealed Mrs. Ashworth's characteristic attention to detail and generosity of spirit. Beyond the expected bequests to James and various charities, there were thoughtful provisions for long-time staff and a particularly touching legacy for Polly Meadows in gratitude for cheerful services rendered at parish events, which brought tears to the young woman's eyes and demonstrated how carefully Mrs. Ashworth had observed the kindnesses that others might have overlooked. Character transformations. Mrs. Dorothy Bellwether's return to Little Wickham after serving her sentence for embezzlement marked a crucial test of the village's capacity for both justice and forgiveness. She had taken a modest cottage on the village's edge, supporting herself through private secretarial work that utilized her organizational skills while keeping her removed from positions of financial trust. Her violet fountain pen had been replaced with a simple blue ballpoint, and her correspondence now carried the careful precision of someone who understood that every detail would be scrutinized for hidden meanings. When she encountered Miss Marple at the post office on a gray November morning, their conversation carried the weight of shared understanding about guilt, redemption, and the complex ways that evil exploits human weakness. "I've been thinking about that afternoon," Mrs. Bellwether said, quietly, her voice stripped of its former authority. "How he used my desperation to create the perfect camouflage for murder. I was so focused on concealing my own crimes that I never questioned why he was so helpful with alibis and explanations." Miss Marple's response reflected the compassionate wisdom that had guided her throughout the investigation. "Evil often succeeds by exploiting our better instincts, my dear. Your guilt made you vulnerable to manipulation, but it also made you ultimately truthful when the stakes became clear. That distinction matters more than you might realize." The romance between Dr. Geoffrey Pemberton and Polly Meadows had blossomed into something genuine and lasting, culminating in a quiet December wedding that reflected both their preference for privacy and the village's understanding that some happiness might emerge from tragedy's aftermath. Polly's transformation from nervous girl to confident young woman demonstrated the strength that could emerge from facing difficult truths, while the doctor's practice flourished as the community came to appreciate his genuine concern for their welfare. Institutional changes. The banking reforms instituted following Mr. Trent's conviction extended far beyond Little Wickham, with financial institutions across the region implementing new oversight procedures requiring dual signatures on trust transactions and independent audits of estate management. The Church Restoration Fund, now operating under rigorous oversight, had accumulated sufficient donations to begin repairs on St. Jude's ancient roof, a project that served as both practical necessity and symbolic gesture of the community's commitment to rebuilding what had been damaged. James Thornbury's dedication to responsible estate management had surprised everyone who remembered his earlier desperation for immediate inheritance. His contribution of personal funds to complete the church repairs demonstrated genuine appreciation for the responsibilities that accompanied inherited wealth, while his decision to remain in Little Wickham rather than flee to London showed a commitment to the community his aunt had served so faithfully. The Memorial Tea. The memorial tea held at Thornfield Manor in early December provided the village with an opportunity for formal closure while celebrating Mrs. Ashworth's continuing influence on their lives. The winter parlor, with its familiar chintz and comfortable furniture, created an atmosphere of warmth that contrasted sharply with the summer house's Gothic shadows. The cornflower spode was brought out again, handled with the particular reverence that accompanies objects that have witnessed history. When Polly served tea from the restored service, her movements carried new confidence, and Miss Marple noted how she positioned the sugar bowl just out of habit's reach, a small gesture that rippled through several hearts that understood its significance. During the gathering, a subscription list for the church restoration passed from hand to hand with the quiet excitement of a community project that meant something beyond mere fundraising. When the paper reached Miss Marple, she discovered tucked beneath it a cream note card in Mrs. Ashworth's unmistakable handwriting. "If ever you should take tea at Thornfield in my absence, pray make yourself at home." The dated message, nearly a year old, had somehow found its way to exactly the moment when such permission mattered most. As the afternoon concluded, Polly presented Miss Marple with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's only a tea strainer," she explained with characteristic modesty, "but I thought cups shouldn't have to carry such burdens. It fits the spode exactly, so nobody need fish for leaves again." The gift was perfect in its thoughtful practicality, representing both healing and prevention, exactly the sort of solution that emerged from understanding how small details could prevent large tragedies. Miss Marple's final reflections. As Christmas approached and the village settled into winter's comfortable rhythms, Miss Marple found herself considering the enduring lessons that emerged from their encounter with sophisticated evil. The case had demonstrated once again how the most dangerous criminals operated not through dramatic gestures, but through patient exploitation of the very trust that made community life possible. Walking through the village on Christmas Eve, she observed the subtle signs of recovery and renewal that marked genuine healing rather than mere forgetting. The threatening letter that had begun their investigation now rested in police files, its crude ultimatum serving as evidence of how misdirection could conceal far more calculating crimes. Yet the village had learned to look beyond surface appearances, to examine the small details that revealed large truths about human nature and institutional vulnerability. The summer house at Thornfield Manor, visible through the cedar trees as she passed, had been transformed from a scene of violence into a peaceful garden retreat. Its Gothic windows no longer seemed to watch with malevolent patience, but had returned to their original purpose of framing views of herbaceous borders and ancient trees. The building itself seemed to have forgotten its dark purpose, becoming once again merely what any summer house should be, a place for quiet reflection and the appreciation of natural beauty. The pattern complete. In her cottage that evening, Miss Marple settled into her familiar chair with her knitting, the pattern she had been working on throughout the investigation finally nearing completion. The intricate Fair Isle design had required careful attention to color changes and complex counting, much like the case itself, where each small detail had contributed to the larger picture that revealed both method and motive with devastating clarity. The village had not merely survived its encounter with calculated deception, but had emerged with a deeper appreciation for the vigilance that community life required. Trust, while more carefully given now, remained the foundation of their social fabric, tempered by wisdom rather than destroyed by cynicism. As the church bells of St. Jude's rang across Little Wickham to mark Christmas morning, their familiar clarity carried more than temporal significance. They marked a community's return to the comfortable rhythms of village life, enriched by hard-won understanding of both human frailty and human resilience. The threatening letter found in the teacup had led them through a labyrinth of financial crime and calculated murder, but it had ultimately revealed the enduring power of careful observation and patient truth-telling to expose even the most elaborate forms of criminal deception. The game, as that first crude message had so dramatically declared, was indeed over, but the wisdom that emerged from its resolution would continue to inform Little Wickham's understanding of how respectability must be distinguished from genuine virtue, and how the smallest details often revealed the most important truths about the complex and sometimes dangerous nature of human behavior. Miss Marple folded her completed knitting with satisfaction, understanding that some patterns, once fully revealed, provided templates for recognizing similar designs in the future. The mystery was solved, justice had prevailed, and the village could rest in the knowledge that careful attention to human nature, in all its complexity, remained the best defense against those who would exploit the very bonds that made their community possible.